All right, so what I want to do now is actually talk about how to unwrap the Gladius. We've done the shield. It's pretty simple, and if we kept our objects simple, of course this was a lot more complex than the other one, but the Gladius is a fairly complex object, so let's go ahead and get into that nasty booger. Save that. Gladius 02. Looks like I have to make everything airtight still, so I'll do that real quick. I'll step through that. So I've done this a couple times. I think actually, yeah, I have done this video, I think. But let's go ahead and get started anyway. Alright, so I have most of my Gladius set up. Let's go ahead and attach the new handle. Grab my borders. And then I will bridge my borders. And I haven't looked at my UVs quite yet, so I'm not sure how big or how bad or how nasty they are, but we'll get there. And we'll just say that that model is finished and everything looks fantastic, which I can fix later. Now the thing is, we've got a lot of geometry in the handle, and we don't have a lot of geometry in the blade. So let's go ahead and kind of keep things simple right off the bat and attack the blade. So I've selected the blade handle. I'm in Edit Poly mode. I'm in the sub-object mode, and when I add my unwrap, you'll see that the icon of the sub-object, which is polygon, is actually carried up into the unwrap UV modifier. That means that I am working on a sub-object, and we have discussed this before. If I have nothing selected in my edit poly, and I'm in the sub-object mode, when I add the unwrap, I'm unwrapping essentially nothing. My unwrap window is completely empty of all things that are important in my life. I go back in here and I select my polygons, and I go back into my unwrap with the sub-app on top of the sub-object. I now have my blade, and that is atrociously ugly and beautiful at the same time. Hit flatten mapping. I do this with only objects, and that's about what's expected. So I'm just going to slide this guy over here a little bit, kind of get it situated to where he's out of the way. If I want to, I could grab this edge right here and just weld that one, stitch it selected. And then I could do that down here if I wanted to, or just do these vertices weld selected. And so now my object has a sense of being unified in the UV space and in the unwrap space, UV space and the 3D space. I'm going to go ahead and hit collapse 2 and go to edit poly. So my blade is done. So if I go to sub-object mode, hit Control I can go to my handle. And let's go to the unwrap tool. I'm still using the sub-object of my edit poly to engage the modifier, and I get this wonderful mess, which we have seen before. I'm going to do a cylindrical, actually let's just do a flatten mapping to get it started. Now when we were talking, I said pretty much this would be enough for us to get the grade for our class, and we're past that point. We're going to make this better. But since everything's here, I can kind of go at it a little bit more specifically. So I'm going to grab pieces that I know I can understand. That's the actual top of the guard. That makes total sense. And all the pieces that are welded to that piece are right here. And these are parts of the guard. I got some pieces still missing. So now the one thing that is, it's awesome to be able to hit these sub-objects on the modifier and be able to attack it independently. But it's also kind of a pain in the ass because I can't see my other objects in the 3D view. I still have the sub-object selected. So what I'm going to do is kind of guess my way through this a little bit. First things first, I'm going to turn off backface culling, or ignore backface culling, so I can select this whole piece of geometry, and that's the guard. And get that out of the way. Okay, what are we selected to? Oh, we're welded there. So let's go ahead and break it off. And then I'm going to do the same thing for the handle. Go into the side view. Select all the polygons that I want. And that's the handle. So that's cylindrical. That's cylindrical as hell. And I'm going to go with the cylindrical modifier. Projection. Excuse me, the cylindrical projection. So I'm going to add it to it. I'm going to hit fit so that it snaps to it. If I don't, it's way up here wherever it decides to land, which seems to be arbitrary to me. Make it fit so it fits just this geometry that I have selected, and you'll see that it has that little cut where the geometry is a little off. That's that green line right there that I was talking about. It's the seam of where your maps roll to each other, and I'm going to rotate that just a little bit so that I get that cleaned up right there. Deactivate that function, Now slide this over. Now I'm kind of left with all the pieces and parts that make up the actual guard. And that's cylindrical too. Ba-doop. Sweetness. I've left something out. I did. Deactivate that function, grab that piece, redo the projection. And what I want to do here is make sure that my edge lines up with the edge of my handle. So I'll go back to that projection real quick, and I want to make sure that that's the handle. That's where I want to make sure that these edges line up cleanly. So in order to do that, I want to double check that face is lined up to that face, and then this one should be right next to each other, and that's good. That means that my seam on the actual grip of the handle and the seam of the guard match greatly, perfectly, wonderfully. Go to the pommel, repeat the process. I'm going to deselect this bottom pole piece because I like it. I don't want to rebuild it. Cylindrical, fit. And again, I want to make sure the seams all match up. So far, the UVs have been matching up quite cleanly. So I just want to make sure. And everything looks like it's doing just fine. Yes. So let's go ahead and get this a little scaled down a little bit. All right, so there's my handle. Let's go ahead and pack everything in that space. All right, so I've got that in there. I'm going to slide this over here to this downward angle and go to this collapse to editable poly again. Now all my UVs are baked into my object and everything's happy. Now I'm going to go back to the unwrap and apply it to the entire object. Go to my open editor window, and now if I go pack, I get an issue with proportions, which is what we have seen and we are expecting, so we're not worried. Things seem to be legit. So I'm going to go into this little area right here, select this piece, and I'm going to just kind of slide it over and kind of organize myself a little bit more effectively. I'm essentially playing Tetris here. We've all played Tetris? Sort of. Come on, it's the greatest video game ever to hit the Nintendo handheld. The Game Boy. The Game Boy original. Alright, so there's my basic handle, there's my basic sword, everything's kind of looking alright. If I go into this texture checker to verify everything, one of the things I want to look at is making sure that the seams are kind of lined up around the handle, which they all are. I know that the bottom of my pommel is going to be different from the rest of the actual pommel because the way I actually have handled the pole itself. But I like the way the solution is heading, and I could actually add to some modeling techniques to get it a little bit more push. Now, I've got that set up. Here's the next step, and we're going to take this into Substance. Now, I'm going to go ahead and type in Substance. We're using Substance Painter, not Designer. Painter's taking the materials you made in Designer and paint them on your object. Let's go ahead and, while that's opening, I'm going to take this object that I have selected. I'm going to export it. And I'll share with you the actual pop-up screen that comes up. When we're exporting, we're going to export selected every time, because otherwise it'll export everything in your scene, and I don't know what's in here. I'm going to export this thing. I'm just going to call it Gladius 00, and I'm going to put it in the folder I can find, which will be my scenes folder, because I'm keeping that consistent. And we're using an Autodesk star.fbx. That's an actual Filmbox extension. We'll get into the discussion of that later, but it's a very good general output that takes vertex data, mapping data, animation data, bones, and all kinds of things, and it applies it to basically almost any software that can read it, which is most of them. A couple key things we'll have to have checked here, which I will share with you when I get the specifics. I always forget which one's which, but whatever. I'm going to hit OK. Now I've made an FBX of this object. And type, should be in here, refresh. Yeah, 3D object, FBX, that's it right there. All right, so what I'm going to do with this is open up all these other tools I have. Here we go. Substance. Now, Substance is a lot like Photoshop, but not entirely like Photoshop. It's owned by Photoshop, but it's not quite like Photoshop. What we're going to do with Substance has actually used the surfaces that they've created and apply them and actually get details by using masking and some other blending tools. The first things we got to do is get our object in here. So I do new. We're going to be using the Unity 5 template. And then what we do is find our object. There it is. It's an FBX. It's looking for an FBX. I don't have anything else in here to worry about, so I'm just going to hit OK. And it's going to take a minute to load up, depending on how fast your machine is. Now, the navigation tools in this software reflect more of that of a game engine. I'm holding Alt and left click to move the mouse, Alt and right click to scale, and Alt and middle mouse button to pan. You're going to see that to be the actual common camera controls in 90% of the software we're using. 3ds Max's has to be different. F will center the object on the image on the camera so we can see everything. So I've got my UVs and I've got my object. So what's cool about this software? Just drag and drop a cool material, and already I'm looking pretty awesome. All right, so that's kind of what an idea of what we can do here. If I go into this tool, first thing you got to do all the time in Substance when you want to make some really cool materials is that you got to bake the mesh maps. What we're going to do with bake the mesh maps, we're going to basically tell Substance where the alignment of our geometry is and where it matches up to each other, where the UVs match up to each other, and how they relate to the actual UV space in the 3D object. And it gives us several different maps that us to work with. Most of what we're looking for is specularity, normals, and a couple other things, roughness and metal. Now I hit OK. If you notice that it's already a tighter reflection than it was when I first put it on here. All right, so let's take that back. Let's get that one there. Yeah, sweet. It's a very modular window-based system, drag and drop. You can throw windows into any corner of the software, which will get real frustrating if you're not careful. So right here, what I'm going to do, just to kind of get an idea, if we want, we can make it a human fleshed object. So gross. The neat thing about this software is that this is an actual material that is built, and I just drag it and drop onto it, and I can scale how much tiling it has, and I can get a different kind of scaling type texture, so I can make it look more like human skin in a cold lab, such as this one. What I want to do is maybe change up how I want to actually affect things. So the surface has a certain resolution. Right now, all those materials on here are 2048 by 2048. My object is irrelevant. I think we've talked about the scale of the UVs and how it matters, and that really reflects on what size material is on the actual object. What I can do at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take this trash can out. I'm going to take that thing off, and I want to tighten up what I'm using this material for. What really neat, since we got a nice clean UV set and we understand what's going on with our UVs, I'm going to add a mask. We got to use a mask to do any real fun work with this software. So I'm going to add a mask. You can add a black mask or a white mask. And if you remember, white is on and black is off. I just added a black mask, so everything is off. Got it? So let's go ahead and put it on the actual blade itself. So I'm going to use this cool tool. I think it's this one. I think it allows me to select by geometry. So I just did a quick drag and drop selection, and if I double click on this, you can see what's being masked out. I just basically turned the blade from a black mask to a white mask, so now it's showing the cobalt metal material on the blade itself. Make sense? Now if I want to change, say, the handle, let's change the guard to something a little bit more wood-like. So I'll grab here, let's find the actual guard. There's the actual guard material. So what's happening now is that it's actually getting the cobalt material, and I'm not sure I want to do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit X. Y'all see this little slide up here? It goes black to white. Hit X, and it goes to the black color. So what I can do now is just basically recover those up, and I'm going to add a new material. So what we're going to do is we're going to do, let's see, what's a good one? Leather bag. Let's make it leather, because sure. So I'm going to just apply it. I'm going to just apply it up here to the top of the layer. I can drag and drop to my object. I can do a lot of different things. If I move this material layer down below the actual cobalt, you'll see that the metal is picking up the actual bump of the leather bag, and there's a ways to get rid of that as well. Let's go ahead and swap that back out. And since we're just focusing that want it to just be on the guard, I'm going to add a white mask so everything's showing, and I'm going to use the polygon clicker, and I'm going to basically mask out what I don't want, which is basically all these other big pieces. And that one. So now our guard has a leather cover on it, and since it's above the actual metal blade and that part of the metal blade is masked out, just the metal is showing on the blade itself. And so let's go ahead and add iron diamond plate to on top of our layer. And now I'm going to scale this image down so we have a little bit more control, and we're going to make that just the pommel, because that's pretty sexy right there, don't you think? Alright, so again, I'm going to do a white mask, and then I'm going to go to the polygon selection and select everything I don't want, or mask out what I don't want, which is that too, and that. Now remember in Max, if I were to actually put the UV back on here and open up this editor and go to here, we have that issue right there. And it's still there in Substance, so what we would have to do is be very particular about how we'd actually build this up. And there's other ways to go about it. And there's other things we could do. I can throw a different material on here altogether to kind of change that. So I want y'all to be conscientious of these kinds of things. But look what the surfacing is doing. It's getting this nice little cool texture that's not in the geometry at all. Alright, so last but not least, we'll go for the handle, which will make... This looks good. We've all wanted some diamond coated handles on our object, on our sword, right? Alright, so let's go ahead and add a black mask. Everything goes away except for the handle, which I will use the polygon selector tool again and select what I want, and it'll make the mask. Let's make the actual color white. There we go. Boop. Alright, now this is for the Gladius at this point, since we're not even at the game engine. That is enough for this grade. Now there's lots of cool things what's happening. I want to kind of spend this last few minutes on this software talking about what's going on, because it's a PBR, it's physically based rendering technologies. This is what game engines are using. We've all seen, what was it, Dragon's Age, the last one, Inquisition? Y'all remember the commercial when the guy walked out of the fire and his all awesome armor and all awesome thing, and then a tinfoil hat and tinfoil boots? It's just, the whole image breaks. Well, that's the awesomeness. It's like an actual, it's a parametrically built material that looks like crumpled aluminum. So the key thing on this one, guys, this is something that's going to take some time. It does not matter on this grade right now, but y'all see how ugly that seam is? You know, we've all played Fallout and Skyrim, right? We all seen these images before in games, right? We don't want to see these images in our works because we're trying to get a job, and that means you have to be perfect. Sorry. Get a job with Bethesda, and you no longer have to be perfect ever again. You can just chunk out chunk, and it's just fine. All right, so PBR is actually what it's using is HDRI imagery to render, which is, I think, in here, display settings. And I can go into the environment opacity. And you'll see how the sun is actually, the angle of the light from the sun and the photo is actually what's causing it. So let's turn the blur off so you can see what it actually is being used. Textures, text-based explosion. All right, so you can see how I can just circle the camera around. It's a full spherical sky map like we have in game engines, and it's actually producing the light data for our object, which is where our lighting is actually coming from with a lot of our awesome materials in game engines. I can change what it is that I am playing around with. They got out several different maps, and it totally changes the light, the hue, and the reflectivity of everything. And a lot of these things are just how you can display things. Now, you could do this and throw it on an actual scene, kind of paint in some shadows in Photoshop, and people say, hey, that looks like an actual object in that scene. Unless you're working in games, and they go, hey, looks like you used the panoramic view from Substance. Good job. Further. Go make it bigger. All right, so that's basically what's going to allow us to make it texture things. In a few minutes, with some masking and some basic things, you can see how quickly you can texture an object and get it to a certain point. So if people go, all right, I got an object. It looks like a sword. It has some nice details. I like it. Turn that down to 2. And so that is the gorgeousness of Substance. When we output everything, we're going to output our maps, and the FBX of this model stays the same. We are not affecting geometry in Substance, just how it's rendered. Got it? And that's it. You can do some basic stuff in here. It has a UV function. Don't trust it. I tested it today. It's bad. Don't do it. Do it in Max. At that point, when we go to export, you'll get a whole bunch of other things. We'll do some discussions on what's going on here. But it's going to give us these 4 different maps for us. And you don't even need an emission because there's nothing emitting from it. But we want the albedo, which is color. Remember we were talking about that in the material editor. Max calls it diffuse. Everyone else calls it albedo these days. Metallic smoothness, and that's going to be how well the metallic renders out and reflectivities show. And then when we export that, we'll throw it all together in Unity or Unreal and assemble it and apply it to our object. It's going to output 4 maps to go onto a single geometric object. So it's very exclusive. It's not very modular. Got it? So that's our video for this stuff.